right. Welcome, everyone. Let's let people filter back in. Yeah, I'm up on the screens and slide. There we go. Cool. Okay, so we will discuss assessing the balance between visibility and confidentiality in ICS networks. I know this is a topic, or it's like, oh, the encryption debate again. Like, yeah, sort of, but the thing is that that debate has been kind of false, or at least not as robust as I think it should be or should have been in the past. So let's revisit this discussion and see what we can glean from a detection and defense standpoint. So with that in mind, ICS and ICS security. How does that look? It's insecure by design, right? We're all used to this. You know, nothing too new here. But in looking at industrial control system and operational technology environments, we're really talking about a communication environment where protocols are generally unencrypted. This has been brought up in discussions from previous talks this week, so this is nothing new to anyone who's been paying attention and attending talks. But as a result, very critical traffic passes in the clear, allowing it to be inspected, potentially manipulated, although we'll get to that in a little bit. And when it is present, any sort of transportation level security is either an add-on or something that is wrapped in another protocol. So maybe it passes through a VPN or some other device, or you're using something like we've seen examples with Modbus and so forth, where there is a encrypted version that is just simply a bolt-on of transportation layer security on the underlying vulnerable protocol. So okay, cool stuff. Well, one of the problems with this is that endpoint solutions in industrial environments are kind of like this creature here. Like, I've heard a lot about them, but I kind of don't see them outside of things like 5-year-old antivirus with out-of-date signature sets and so forth. That certainly you might have a AV engine baked into a certain product, but it's not typically up to date. And the revolution in endpoint analysis that we've seen in IT environments with lots of very complex and very effective, in some cases, endpoint detection and response products has not made it into the industrial environment for a variety of reasons, some of which are very good, whether we're talking about the ability to do things like blocking process execution on a machine learning or an automated level is kind of disastrous if you're thinking about an industrial environment, or the increased integration of cloud analysis in a lot of endpoint products to push back to a vendor are just non-starters in a lot of cases for industrial. So we don't really have these endpoint options that we would see in IT. So instead, the evolution of industrial control system security has followed this pathway that, well, other than some very high level, or depending on how you want to look at it, analysis of files and maybe scanning USBs and whatnot when they're introduced, we're really reliant upon being able to analyze and inspect network traffic in control system environments. And we can analyze that for things such as developing baselines, creating asset inventories instead of having to actually manually do that. Who the hell would ever want to do that, right? So populating asset maps, but also security alerting, whether that's looking for more traditional IT-like behavior within layer 2.5 and lower environments, or outputting just observations to defenders and operators to give them an awareness of what's going on outside of what you would see from process-oriented monitoring that you would get from a historian. However, this comes with a risk, and this risk has been pointed out by many individuals, including Ralph Langner, who I don't believe is here this year. So I'm giving him a shout out, and he can't even appreciate it. That stinks. But the risk of visibility in this case is that certainly plant operators need to worry about simple threat actors, and so we go to a network traffic-based monitoring approach to detect them. But then, as we get ICS security monitoring taking care of those threat actors, there is this notional possibility of top-tier threat actors taking advantage of this and being able to snipe traffic on the wire, replay commands, or modify items. And thus, as Ralph pointed out, and as others have pointed out, the deep packet inspection network-based security monitoring ecosystem is essentially founded upon a vulnerability in the way that industrial networks operate. And we can ask ourselves, like, is it worthwhile to continue operating in a semi-vulnerable fashion if it leaves us open to potentially dangerous situations? Now, so if security monitoring can view ICS traffic in the clear, then so can ICS targeting adversaries, whether that's because they've compromised endpoints, they're sniffing, they're doing things like ARP poisoning, DNS poisoning, etc., thus giving rise to risks of traffic interception, traffic manipulation, and even potentially traffic modification. All very scary things. If an adversary can do things like arbitrarily modify control system traffic as it's flowing through the environment, that leaves up the possibilities of arbitrarily changing commands in such a way way that they do the opposite of what operators intended at a certain point of time, which could lead towards disastrous outcomes, or similar notional threat vectors. And I say notional for an important reason, because traffic manipulation attacks are real. They have taken place. We've seen examples of either attempted items like VPN filter, which had a Modbus capability, although one that was not necessarily actioned or implemented in a way that we know resulted, or that we can prove in a public fashion resulted in some sort of effect. But we have seen tools like the router and network device manipulation in the Palmetto Fusion campaign linked to Russian government actors. We've seen things like traffic manipulation on the DNS or traffic, like man-on-the-side capability, like with the quantum capabilities used by the US government. Read up on that one if you haven't. That's a very fascinating topic. So we've seen this sort of traffic manipulation, traffic capture or replay attacks take place in IT environments. So we see this visibility versus security trade-off as, somewhat real, and, my oh my, won't someone please think of the PLCs with these scary potential network traffic attack vectors that are out there? Well, that's true, but the thing is that if we actually start taking a look at how attacks manifest in industrial environments, whether that's, looking for our mythical black hoodie hacker or whatever, and how that's actually played out, we start seeing something a little interesting in terms of what these attacks actually look like and how adversaries have been prosecuting these intrusions for really the past almost 15 years, going back to the dreaded S word. So in looking at intrusions over time, we can look at the greatest hits. And if anyone wants a sticker version of this, catch me after my talk or whatever, and I'm happy to give you one. We've seen things like the Black Energy events, Stuxnet, Havex, Indestroyer 1 and 2, Triton or Trisis, and all these other sorts of items. While we don't have a very large population of known public industrial targeting and industrial impactful events, we have enough that we can start drawing at least some general trends of what adversaries are doing, whether from a pure access perspective, like we've seen with the Dragonfly campaigns, or to actual disruptive levels like with Indestroyer and Triton. So in looking at this, we have lots of, well, not lots, but a significant number of examples to learn lessons from. But if we look for examples that tie into traffic modification, we see something that looks like, kind of my backyard in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where the tumbleweeds are flowing past, but really nothing else of substance there for us to sink our teeth into. Now, you may make the comment like, well, didn't Stuxnet do traffic manipulation? Well, not really, because the thing is that if we look at the ICS threat landscape in actuality, what we've observed is that adversaries instead have focused their efforts on compromising endpoints in industrial environments, getting access to the engineering workstation, getting access to the data historian and other items, and applying fairly standard IT-focused tradecraft to move laterally into these environments. And then once access is attained, usually via reuse of credentials, very rarely using exploits, although the dreaded S word, we saw exploits in play there, and then just blend in with legitimate operations. We've seen this with Indestroyer 1 and 2, that they weren't modifying traffic within the substations in question. Instead, we saw the adversary take over endpoints and send, well, in the first case, really crappy IEC 104 based and other protocol traffic that didn't quite work effectively. In Indestroyer 2's case, as Robert mentioned in his talk yesterday, a much more robust implementation, but using the protocols as designed from trusted endpoints in the environment in order to gain impact. Basically operating the system in a way that it was designed to operate in, but in a way that undesirable by the operators, either by doing some certain actions at an undesirable time, or in a way that would be outside the boundaries of what one would want at a given instance. And we've also seen the removal of things like system integrity in the Triton case and modifying safety logic, or attempting to modify safety logic, I should say, because that didn't work either. You can read more about that in some of the resources I've linked at the end of this presentation. But ultimately, using this pathway of get into the industrial environment via some IT mechanisms, swimming through the OT environment in a fashion, using fairly standard pen tester tradecraft, and then leveraging trusted endpoints in order to deliver some effects capacity without ever having to worry about fancy things like ARP poisoning or man-in-the-middling or person-in-the-middling traffic in any fashion. So defenders have a dilemma that threats are certainly real. Rob Lee will tell you that all day, every day, or whatever, that the threats are real. But endpoints are unavailable for the most part, especially in very robust ways. We're lucky if we're just getting endpoint logs, let alone doing actual endpoint protection. So that makes network monitoring, given the layout of insecure protocols and traffic visibility, not just possible, but very vital. But in doing so, we have a built-in vulnerability that traffic is available to others to look at as well. So security is certainly necessary, but we want to try to achieve that without creating additional problems in the meantime. So what do we do? Well, what we do is we apply a threat-centric model to defense. I do a lot of cyber threat intelligence work. That's what I did at Dragos. It's kind of part of what I do with Gigamon and other places right now. And I say that not because it's a field that pays fairly well, but rather say that because a threat-informed defensive posture is one that takes into consideration the realities of adversarial tradecraft and applies them towards trade-offs in what security decisions we should and arguably could be making. So we first want to understand what adversaries are doing, review the events that we know about in industrial environments as well as in IT environments, because Cobalt Strike, pass the hash, and all these other sorts of techniques are being used before we get into those last stage effects of actually applying an industrial focused impact within these environments. And then we want to orient our defenses not towards the notional threat, but to what adversaries are actually doing. No one here, especially in the ICS world, has an unlimited security budget, so we can't solve all problems simultaneously, but instead we need to vector resources in such a fashion that we're dealing with the problems of right now and the critical items that could actually impact us in the immediate sense. So in that case, we can then monitor for events and incidents using the investments we have made in terms of visibility wherever it's most applicable, and then continuously collect on adversary behaviors to make sure that we don't remain static. So everything I'm talking about here that, network security monitoring, you might want to do it, that's just because of the state of the now in terms of what adversaries are doing. And we'll get into some evolutions that may cause us to, in the future, and certainly for some asset owners in the right now, to question whether this trade-off really is a viable option depending upon what your environment is doing. So from a threat-centric defensive perspective, if our threats are simply knocking over endpoints and then abusing legitimate communication pathways, we probably want to emphasize monitoring right now. Yeah, it sucks that we have to have critical communication flowing in the clear and leaving some other security mechanisms by the wayside, but you know what? If we're trying to put out the fires of today and not addressing the notional threats or the DEF CON presentation threats or whatever of right now, then you know what? We need to kind of deal with the hand that we've been dealt and apply the best mechanisms that we can in order to resolve these issues right now. So there is an inherent trade-off, but it's one that's arguably between largely notional traffic manipulation effects. I've seen this demonstrated in lab environments. I've seen other presentations on this, and it's certainly a potential threat, but it's outweighed by the actual incidents and what we've seen from adversary behaviors. Now, again, this is just what's going on now. This can change, which is why a threat-centric approach means continuous collection, analysis, and monitoring, so that when our little boy here is balanced out by another little boy or girl or whatever on the other end of the seesaw, that we are aware of that and can change our posture accordingly. But part of that means that integrity risks remain. That while traffic manipulation might not necessarily be something that has emerged in reality, it certainly is something that is notionally possible, and we can't just ignore it. Yeah, we can balance and make trade-offs or whatever in light of what adversaries are doing, but we should still prepare for ways of dealing with this. However, universal encryption does have costs to it. We've talked, and others have noted things like latency issues, overhead issues in terms of processing power. These are largely going away, but at the same time, there is still that blinding ourselves to our own environments by adding a layer of security that might not necessarily be required in order to meet what adversaries are doing. However, we do want to make sure that we have some way of at least catching or preventing these notional manipulation attacks, and that could arguably be done in a much cheaper fashion, not through full encryption, but rather through robust integrity checks and verification that may suffice to identify and prevent instances where an adversary has been able to snipe traffic on the wire, make some modification, and then apply it in such a fashion that it results in an undesirable impact in an industrial environment. So along those lines, we could look at a trust but verify approach to industrial security. That full encryption comes at a significant cost at this point because we can't balance that out with robust endpoint detection and monitoring. So to retain the advantages and really the options that we have right now, it is arguably sufficient to try to continue using these protocols in a way that we can at least analyze them and understand what's going on in our environments, but also layering in verification so that should some of these attacks emerge in the future, we at least layer a preventative or a checksum, essentially, so that we're not completely at the mercy of adversaries that may ultimately implement this sort of an attack technique. So from a threat-oriented visibility perspective, what I'd really like to emphasize is that there are no absolutes. Only a Sith deals in absolutes, as Obi-Wan would say, on Mustafar. Ben Miller's not here, is he? He would get that joke. Anyway, but the idea here being that if we look at our wonderful Purdue model, which is still relevant, I would say, it hasn't gone away entirely. If we're talking about traffic that's leaving our networks or traffic that's passing through infrastructure that we don't own and control, encrypt all the things. Definitely do that. So anything leaving the network, things going over the internet, encrypt the hell out of that and make sure that that's secure, because you don't control things anymore. And we've seen adversaries like the Palmetto Fusion campaign in 2015 to 2018 and whatnot target these sorts of traffic vectors to do things to at least gain initial access to industrial operators. But then as we start getting into network environments, we want to make sure that we're not blinding ourselves through security and start implementing approaches like, for our inter-network communication levels, adopting items like encryption, but enabling some visibility through SSL inspection or SSL proxying gets us the opportunity to then start seeing, yes, I can deploy Cobalt Strike Beacon or Impacket or whatever and use a Let's Encrypt cert and you can't see me anymore. That's fine, but by implementing these sorts of defenses, I can at least start gaining visibility into adversary command and control and potentially adversary lateral movement mechanisms depending upon what they're doing, as long as they're using an asynchronous key exchange. And then as we start getting into lower level networks, unencrypted arguably is the best idea right now in my professional opinion, but we want to at least start driving towards integrity checks to add a layer of defense and security so that should a traffic manipulation attack manifest, we are not left completely wide open to such an action causing harm within our environments. So that's all well and good for right now, but the thing is, we have emerging considerations that we have to take into, be aware of and acknowledge. And some asset owners are already in this situation, whether you're talking about pipelines, wind farms, or other very distributed control system networks, even power system controls. You don't have every substation manned by someone these days. Everything goes to the control center or whatever with the EMS and so forth, controlling multiple things geographically dispersed. Do you own the lines over which that traffic is flowing? Absolutely not. It's flowing over public infrastructure for the most part. And increasingly, vendors, whether for good or for ill, are piping more of your data for preventative maintenance or analytics purposes into cloud environments, or even seeing discussions of things like SCADA in the cloud and so forth. If we start talking about control systems in this perspective, this simple model that we talked about here kind of gets broken because we start seeing a migration from this low level all the way up to this layer 5 passing over public infrastructure. And in these cases, we're taking an environment that previously would have been very suitable for not having encryption into one where it's arguably quite necessary because we have traffic flowing beyond boundaries that we can control and manage. So in looking at this, we see perimeters disappearing. They're not disappearing completely. There's talk about zero trust and all this other garbage. It's yeah, that's cool and all, but at the same time, do not think that perimeters and segmentation are simply disappearing. We as network owners still retain some control over this and should apply this where possible, but while also realizing that legacy perimeter concepts of a very hard distinction between network layers isn't really going to hold water much anymore because of the way things are evolving. As we see distributed networks increasingly adopted for a variety of systems for efficiency purposes and enabling one control center in Denmark to control wind turbines across the globe and so forth, we need to facilitate operations so that that is possible, but doing so in a safe and secure manner so that in applying these sorts of methodologies, we're not also opening ourselves up to potential attack vectors. And that means the fundamentals are still required. So yes, you have a pipeline into the cloud, make sure that's flowing over a VPN. Make sure that VPN concentrator is patched, because adversaries left, right, and center have been knocking over VPN concentrators and similar devices since 2016 as a prime initial infection vector into environments from ransomware to advanced persistent threat sort of actors. So looking at these sorts of items and understanding what controls we can put in place to either ensure traffic security where we have no control over where that traffic is flowing, while also retaining the advantage of own network understanding and management to layer in inspection and visibility, can allow us to try to blend approaches so that it's not just a either or encryption for all or encryption for none, but rather understanding based upon where you're operating and how that communication flows and what infrastructure it flows through, that we're applying solutions that make sense for that item. So yes, it's not a binary decision, but rather a continuum of options based upon what it is you're dealing with and what your security problem is for that specific communication segment. So when looking at this, we want to plan for the security challenges of tomorrow. The cloud is coming. Distributed operations are already here, depending on what sort of asset owner you are. But in doing so, we don't want to ignore the security crises of today. We're still in industrial environments in a visibility poor situation. Certainly there are options in taking advantage of the telemetry we already get from a process perspective and trying to make use of that for security purposes, but not many people are really doing that. We have network visibility right now, and you could even boil that into just pure net flow analysis, although you're arguably losing a lot of context. But we still haven't gotten to a point where the endpoint visibility and analysis that we've become used to in IT security environments is applicable in industrial environments. And until that happens, we really want to make sure that we don't cut our nose off to spite our faces, so to speak, by removing one of the few areas where we have deep visibility today, provided, of course, that that traffic is flowing over an environment that we have some control over and have some reasonable expectation of security and privacy for how that traffic is being transported. So to conclude, threat-centric defense against current ICS reality requires communication monitoring. Unless you are in an environment that allows for, you've been able to sort of square the circle in terms of gaining greater endpoint visibility, you really need to use the tools that are available to you right now. Otherwise, the risk, I would argue, is simply too great given how threat actors are operating, that we would lose all capability of identifying, monitoring, and then responding to these threat actors. However, future considerations need to be kept in mind. Security is not a static field. Keeping that in mind, identifying ways of ensuring continuous process viability as well as process integrity is vital. And so at minimum, moving to a position where protocols are increasingly adopting a verification check of some sort to make sure that traffic is not being manipulated or even corrupted potentially en route, I would argue is vital. And then as we begin addressing other security issues within the industrial environment, we can start adopting security approaches that IT environments have been using for the last 5, 10 years or whatever, of balancing out communication security with endpoint visibility to arrive at a hybrid model of what it is we can see from a threat perspective. And in industrial environments, we could also marry process visibility and analysis into that as well to add a process-specific layer of detection and understanding into security monitoring and controls. So if we wanted to have a TLDR version of this, don't listen to me, listen to Jordy. Encrypt all the things in reducing visibility? Not yet, not so fast. But maximizing network visibility where we can and where it's appropriate seems a viable solution to this for the immediate term, while planning for integrity checks and potential shifts in the environment is really where we ought to be, not engaging in false debates between extremes on either pole, but rather looking at what communication segments we're worried about, what options we have from a security perspective at each, and applying solutions that make sense to that given link in order to ensure that we are adopting a security practice that understands the need for visibility for defensive purposes while also not exposing ourselves unnecessarily to vulnerabilities adversaries can take advantage of to execute potential attacks. So thank you. I have a fair amount of time for questions. These slides, I believe, are going to be available on the app. If so, I have a number of resources here that you can check out for digging deeper into these attacks. But in the meantime, oh, never mind. It's me. Yeah, my contact information is on the slides as well. If anyone has questions, yes, we have one.
Thanks very much. Can you spend just a minute more talking about, within the Purdue model, where encryption is thumbs up and where you're probably not going to do that in today's world, but if you want to just take another minute to talk about where to really think about implementing what controls at what layers. Thanks.
Sure. So really, we could just look at this as a continuum from layer 5 down to layer 1, where we sort of dial encryption up or down based upon where we are. So at layer 5 and getting out into external networks, encrypt all the things. Absolutely, like this is a necessary requirement. It sounds silly, but we still have Telnet, and we still have other sorts of things that are flowing out there, including industrial communication flowing over public networks for distributed network implementations. That all needs to be wrapped in SSL TLS, otherwise we're done. As we start moving down the Purdue model, though, the cost-benefit ratio for encrypted communication starts shifting a little bit more towards visibility. So as you start getting into below layer 3 levels and into layer 2 and down, especially to layer 1, the desirability of encryption becomes significantly less because of the fact that we can't counterbalance the communication opacity or our inability to do deep packet inspection with corresponding host visibility. But the main thing I want to stress, though, is that this isn't very much a either-or proposition, but rather this is something that organizations need to assess, like, do I have information flowing to a public cloud instance or whatever, and how does that apply? Or am I operating in a distributed environment so that I have bits of what are layer 1, layer 2 communications that actually flow over public infrastructure because it's going to a site that's 500 miles away or whatever on the other side of the state or the country or whatnot. So really the takeaway isn't so much like at layer whatever you should do this, but rather based upon the adversarial environment and what you're doing, find a solution that makes sense for what's going on instead of adopting a thou shalt solution for each level that is a one-size-fits-most but leaves a lot to be desired.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes?
Yeah, hi. To the cost-benefit ratio, have you had any luck with conversations around, the various frameworks? Say, NIST frameworks where, say, my company has our policies and standards based off this framework. This is all fine and good, but when it says thou shalt encrypt, it doesn't take into account that subjective, contextual, here's our environment that you were just touching on in that last
Yep.
comment, right? Have you had any conversations or insights on how to bring that conversation to the various levels of management, or say coming from the OT space to the IT space? It's like, no, we need to encrypt everything, but down at layer 0, we're really not gaining. There's no cost-benefit ratio, the risk reduction, all these kind of things. And when I can have at least in my company, when I have a relationship with someone, I can generally get an ear and have a good conversation about it.
Yep.
But the further away I get from those more interactive relationships, it's no, this is what our framework is, this is where our standard is. Trying to work and change those standards is all fine and good, but that can be a bit of a process too.
Right.
Have you had any
So
wins or milestones along those lines?
So I've been trying, mostly through things like this presentation to this audience, where hopefully there are people who, like yourself, who are listening to this and finding ammunition to push back against these one-size-fits-all approaches to matters. I'll have a written version of this published. It was supposed to be published today, but it'll probably come out on Monday on the Gigamon website if you're looking for conversation points around this. But really, it should be asset owners. I would argue that frameworks are nice, but frameworks should be guidelines and not necessarily strict items to adhere to, because everyone's a little different. And recognizing that whether we're talking communication security, we're talking authentication or remote access policies, is vital to come up with security plans that actually make sense, as opposed to things that are just box checking and moving on.
Thank you.
Yep. And I think I'm almost out of time, and it looks like I'm out of questions as well. So thank you, everyone.